Joining me today, I have the pleasure of CFL insider for TSN, Dave Naylor, joining me on the show today. Dave, thank you very much for joining, by the way. I know you're kind of busy on your end, so I appreciate you taking the time. How are things for you right now?
They're busy on the work front, and I'm moving in 2 days. So hence the very casual dress today. I've been moving boxes all day, but when you invited me to join you on your show, I thought I'm going to need a respite from boxes and markers and tape and loading stuff onto the back of a truck. So I'm like, you know what, this will be good for me.
I'm glad to give you some therapy, if you will, away from all that. Because hey, I don't think know of anyone that likes to move. I'm being honest here.
13 and a half years for me, the first one. So there you go.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. Well, let's get into this here, Dave. I have plenty of questions in particular, of course, CFL, XFL will bring up here, but sure. I really loved your take back on April 8th here on the global aspects of the CFL, not only just with the partnership, but just the expansion, CFL 2.0, as it's been labeled ever since we've had Randy Ambrosie come in and become commissioner for the CFL back in 2017. I want to get your thoughts on this. So the CFL and XFL, we've had nibbles that there's maybe a global aspect to this with a partnership. We have, of course, the partnerships the CFL is involved in. How are you looking at this in terms of the competition? We know the European League of Football starting this year. The NFL, as we've heard, not only in Europe, but also now with Canadian stadiums, is starting to get possible interest with international games and is really ramping that up. Where does that leave the CFL right now with or without this partnership?
Well, it's funny because Randy Ambrosie as commissioner, nothing has defined him more than his vision to try to tap into the global potential of football. And, when he first started bringing this up, it was all, to be honest, new to me. I think of football as a North American game. We know that you just look at, the audience for Super Bowl, like 90% of it is in North America, right? It's not, it's just, and the sport has grown and things like that. But we know that it's not like basketball or hockey or baseball where you have all these international players at the highest level. But when he brought that along, I started doing a lot of digging and try to, really go to school on this. And I learned that, it is a very much an emerging sport in Mexico, in Europe, especially Germany, but other places in Germany as well. In Japan, I caught up with Brandon Collier, former UMass player, former CFL player who runs a Dream Chasers tour, he calls it, where he brings kids over to go to all the camps in the spring. And we caught up with him, I guess it was June of 2019 at Penn State, which was really exciting. I mean, he had a quarterback with him there who is now a freshman at TCU. The first European born, bred, trained quarterback to be at a Power 5 school, and that's, remember the name Alexander Honig, because, he could be a game changer. And I say he just enrolled in January. His first year will be in September. So Randy has really talked a lot about this, but wanting to identify players from around the globe, bring them to the CFL. And I guess the question has always been, how do you monetize that? Like, it's neat to have guys from Germany and Sweden and there are NCAA programs that are diving in on this big, like, West Virginia, is just one, for instance, that they got a Swedish tight end, they got a Dutch cornerback, so it's happening, right? You're starting to see happen in college football what happened in college basketball 25 years ago, where guys started showing up from Europe and all of a sudden, that became a regular. But the whole idea was, how do you monetize this? And, the best that we've sort of understood is, well, if you've got, 3 Germans on a team in Canada, maybe Germany wants to buy streaming rights to see it. It always seemed like a bit of a stretch to me. Like I'm not smart enough to know, but like if the quarterback was German, sure. But if the right guard, and the outside linebacker, I'm not sure that drives interest in those countries. So it never really kind of, and that's been the biggest criticism of this from people within the league that I talk to, say, I don't understand how we ever make any money doing this. And as long as you're 9 teams within Canada, I think that is a challenge. Well, one of the things, the day that this got announced on March the 10th with the XFL formal talks, I was given an audience with Danny Garcia and Jeff Pollock, the commissioner of the XFL, or CEO, I guess is maybe his title. And one of the things Danny Garcia said was that the international component, the relationships that Randy Ambrosie has developed and his knowledge and the relationships and the idea of tapping into this global thing was part of what brought the XFL people to the table. And somebody pointed out to me after that she put out an emoji that morning that had 3 things on it: a Canadian flag, a US flag, and the globe. So it was an interesting kind of signature. And all of a sudden it started making sense to me that, Randy's had this vision for globalization, but he's never really had a way to get beyond Canada's borders and a way to kind of grow this. And honest to goodness, I was sitting in my bedroom at night, was going to write a tweet about, I think this global thing may be part of this whole idea. And I put the tweet away and thought, you know what? I'm going to make some phone calls and do some work and maybe write a column on it. And that's what became the column. It was almost a tweet. And I thought, I don't want to waste this on a tweet. This is a good idea. And so when I started phoning around and talking to people, I found out that, yeah, that is definitely part of the shared vision. I think Mexico is where they'd like to go first. I think if they could get this collaborative league off the ground, Canada and the US, I think they see an immediate opportunity in Mexico and ultimately perhaps in Europe. And there's logistics and all this to get around. But all of a sudden it was like, okay, how are these leagues different? 4 downs, 3 downs, playing in the spring, playing in the summer and the fall. Where are they the same? And that's where I arrived at the international thing. And, that's real. Like the growth of football internationally is real. And, the NFL has an academy now in London. They've got the Pathways program where they're trying to develop players, but it's going to be the same. The XFL or the CFL or the collaborative new league is going to get its players the same way those leagues have always got their players, by guys that don't make the NFL. And fortunately, there's a lot of good ones, right? Yes. And the same way there are great college players that don't make the NFL, there are going to be great international players that don't make the NFL. And so, and I think if you have players in Mexico and all over Europe shooting for the NFL, we know most of them are going to come up short. And that doesn't mean they're not going to be quality players. So that's where this plays in. That I think that, it's my belief that the XFL side of this, Redbird and Danny Garcia and Dwayne Johnson, recognize the international growth in football, recognize the potential there, and see through the relationships that Randy Ambrosie has brought up, bringing in global players. I mean, the CFL held combines right before COVID hit. They're holding combines around the globe, right? Identifying the best players and saying, this is an element that we think we would like to be a part of as well. And it, to me, it makes, it makes some sense, because one of the problems the CFL has had is, its business trends have been kind of not always positive in terms of demographics of fans and things like that. Well, this is one where you're definitely looking at a positive growth. You're looking at a game that's growing and you're trying to ride that wave. So, that's now how that plays out, how long it takes for that to play out, and how central a part of this vision this is. I don't know, but I would be stunned if this does come together and there is a new collaborative league between the XFL and the CFL, that it doesn't involve some significant international either component or vision for where they're going to go.
And I think you're talking the ebb and flow absolutely with the league. The consistency has not always been there at times. And I've really been impressed. I know that the marketability and the profitability of the international game for CFL 2.0 hasn't been there, but over the last 6 months, since I've really started getting more invested with the Canadian side, it's shocking how much global perspective, at least global connections, have been made. I mean, we're talking 13 different leagues across the globe. The inroads in Mexico have been outstanding because that league has been taking off. It's only 5 years old as of right now.
Yeah.
And that actually brings me into this next point here. So Mexico, it sounds like, I think you've referenced this in this article as well. Seems to be the first potential stop if you were to do that. Mm-hmm. Just the first one to sign in, and also the one that seems like there's most inroads made. Is that what I'm understanding?
I think that's where they feel there's the most. I mean, and the logistics, frankly, are easier as well, right? Like, traveling in terms of time zones, going Canada, the US and things like that. I think they believe there's television opportunities there. I think they believe there are Spanish language American television opportunities there as well. So that, because, in Canada, we don't always appreciate how big the Spanish language market is in the United States, right? It's always kind of one of those eye openers. If you go to Texas or California, you're like, holy smoke, I didn't realize how much of this country is Spanish speaking. So that's the opportunity as well, that they see. And that's, I think the idea, you look at sports that are further developed internationally. I mean, they have developed leagues all over the world, whether we're talking hockey, whether we're talking baseball, whether we're talking basketball. Football doesn't. Football, once you get past the CFL and the NFL, it's essentially semi-pro, right? I mean, there are guys making money in Europe, but they're not making a living out of it. So what are the, and every time an alternative league comes along, right? And I'm a bit of a student of history on this. I was in high school when the USFL came along, and I followed.
Hey, I love reading on the USFL. That's why I bring it up. It's just like,
and I remember it, right? And then I have a brochure for something called the Professional Spring Football League that was supposed to play its Red, White, and Blue Bowl at RFK Stadium in 1992. I have a ticket brochure for that league. So I'm a bit of a student of alternative professional football, and every time they come along, I always ask myself, okay, what's different here? What can work? What's going to separate this league away from the others? And with an XFL CFL collaboration, there are two things that jump out to me potentially. One is the international component, bringing in global players, involving global players in the league, going to global markets, trying to tap, a league where if you had a contract, you start to think, you got a contract in Canada, you got a contract in the US, you have a contract in Mexico, you have a contract in Germany, have a place in, now all of a sudden, you don't have to hit the home run in every market because you've got international television rights. That's one idea, right? Right. Mm-hmm. The other thing that jumps out to me is gambling, right? Because we have a legal gambling environment upon us. The bill passed the House in Canada last week. It's going to the Senate. Everybody's preparing for it. We at TSN are preparing for it. Everybody is. And we know that in North America, everybody's favorite sport to bet on is football, right? And so if you are going to operate, and I actually hope they don't, I don't think you can play in February in Canada, okay? So, and I don't think you need to. I've always, one of the things I think the alternative football leagues have always got wrong in the past is, well, we're going to kick off the week after the Super Bowl when football interest is at its highest, right? And I'm always thinking, wait a minute, I love football almost as much as anybody I know. But by the time I've lived through an entire CFL season, entire NFL season, bowl season, triple header playoffs through January, 2-week build up to the Super Bowl, and then the Super Bowl, even I need a break. So it's like, so I think actually you don't have to start in February. I think starting, about mid-April, early April, would make sense. You could play a 14-game season, 16-game season easily to get to the end of August. If you did that, you're basically saying that if you want to bet on football between April and September, we're it, right? And you can promote the league that way. And you can promote that way in the United States. You can promote it that way in Canada. That leads to viewership. And people will say, well, why didn't the CFL do that on its own? Well, they could. But what kind of betting card is 4 games a week? Especially by the time you get to the second half of the season, when you have matchups between teams that have had good years and teams that are having bad years, and your 13-2 team is playing your 2-13 team, those are not great games to handicap. We know. So I think that's a restriction for the XFL, that if they have 8 teams, 4 games a week, where you put it together and you start talking about 18, 20 games a week. Now you're talking about a betting card where somebody can look at it and say, okay, I like those games. I don't like those games. I kind of like these, which is what sports bettors do, right? So sure. I think that's the other component of this that stands out for me as an opportunity that can potentially differentiate this league from, some past failings at alternative football, which, look, I would be, wrong to suggest that this isn't risky, or that when you're trying something that other people have tried that has never been successful, to dismiss the difficulty of accomplishing this is foolhardy. So but those are the things that sort of make me look at it and say, okay, there's a couple ideas here that maybe we haven't seen before, and maybe these can move the needle. That, and I guess the fact that the last XFL, did have sustainable television numbers, right? They were still moving in the wrong direction. And I think at some point your league has to get to the point where, as the weeks go by, your audience builds rather than diminishes. And that hadn't happened in the 5 weeks that the XFL played. But the numbers that they produced, were, if you put them next to other major sports properties, they weren't bad. And I know in an interview that Alex Shiner, who's the head of the sports division for Redbird Capital, did about 3 weeks before the XFL CFL collaboration talks were announced, he pointed that out and said that their question about alternative football had always been, is there an audience for it there? Like, does it exist? And their read of the XFL's 5 weeks was that they demonstrated there was.
Yeah. And I think alternative football anyway, if we're talking leagues that are just outside of even, like, say, the indoor leagues, it's growing. Actually, in 2022, this is something I've been double checking on here, a little quick fact, I guess. Say we get the CFL in 2022, which, I'm hoping we do in some capacity, XFL, who knows, but say in theory, they all are able to play. Combine that with, we have 4 other leagues I've already counted up that are saying they're going to play in 2022, or they're planning on it. They're having infrastructure built. There's 6 for next spring. You have 6 right now that are asking for players, coaches, TV, and that's all for an audience that seems to be growing.
Well, I mean, there's reason people always keep trying this is there is a irresistible combination of a strong appetite for the sport of football among television networks and viewers, and a really robust supply of good players that will play for far, far less than the NFL minimum. And that's, as long as you have that, somebody's going to be. Now, some of these leagues, as you've probably noticed in the past, never get off the drawing board, like the professional spring football league, right? That they're just kind of an entity, and the investors. I would probably think of 3 or 4 leagues that I've read their prospectus, and somehow they never kicked off, right? So I think that's one thing to be aware of. But people are going to keep trying it, right? Because people look at the NFL, the money they make, and think, if I can just get a tiny piece of that, right? But it's been a hard thing to do, because it's not. First of all, the one thing I think is a total no chance for success is, and I get this sent to me all the time. How about a development league? No, development leagues are death, right? Development leagues, you're not cheering for your team to win the championship. You're not critiquing your GM or head coach on what they did. That organization exists to develop players for somebody else.
Right.
And as soon as you do that, you take the steam out of it. So, like, players are always going to move on, like they do in European soccer, right? Where they move on, but they aren't development leagues or development teams per se. And that's, everybody in the CFL has kind of had their hill that they die on this, like, I'd rather have no league than this. And I'm not one of those people when it comes to 3 downs or 110 yards or whatever. I mean, I love the CFL. I love, Canadian culture. But 3 downs and 110 yards is not like hill to die on territory for me. Development league would be. Like, I just don't think there's any point of going down that road and saying, well, we're going to become a development league for the NFL. It just, I have no interest as a fan or as a journalist in anything like that, which they're not talking about that. So I'm glad, but that's the one idea that, like, fans bring up to me all the time. Well, development league. And I'm just like, yeah, no, there's a reason one doesn't exist. And
Right.
So,
well, it's funny that it's brought up, because the NFL is most famously tried this, and it's strange to me looking back. Like, I'm going to bring up NFL Europe for a second.
Yeah.
Because it's a developmental league, but what's funny about it was that they wanted it to potentially be its own thing with the developmental aspect. And I always point to that, where it's like, well, they lost $30 million, but they also purposely said, let's be a developmental as well as pushing the European ball that we want. And now that it's developed with the German leagues that is excellent out there, the GFL, you've got, for example, the French league that's also partners with the CFL too, and many others. One of them, the Danish league, actually have a friend that's quarterback in, funny enough, Aaron Ellis, going to plug him here. But, it's funny how that's grown since. And, we still hold it, like you're saying, the developmental league. I completely get it, because I think it does have to be either professional or really nothing.
Well, that's where, like, the NFL seemed to have kind of a split mission in Europe, right? Like, in one way, it was a place to hothouse players, and let's be honest, develop quarterbacks, right? That's what they were trying to do. But you need a whole team to do that. So it was a place to hothouse quarterbacks and develop players kind of in general. But I don't think those cities ever really felt ownership over those teams, because the goal of everybody was to move on, right? So it was clearly, in any definition, it was a developmental league. And especially if you're trying to entice a new market, I just don't think that's the way you do it. And it's funny because that's, that even when I was writing about that, I looked at, I thought about Europe and said, well, it's not like, there was the World League of American Football, which became NFL Europe. But in both cases, they were kind of development leagues. And the CFL has struggled with kind of that idea of, well, how quickly do we allow players to flow through our league, right? Do we allow guys to come here for half a season and then go? And it's been an eternal debate about, well, no, you should have to commit 2 years. And then other people say, well, we got good guys sitting by the phone that won't sign because they got to sign a 2-year deal, right? If you give them, and I've always been more for the idea that let players go out of their contracts. And here's the reason why. Most guys who get cut from the NFL after college never make the NFL. That is the reality, right? And sometimes it's not because they're not good enough. It's just there's another college class of guys with a year younger and a year less, on their tires, and it's hard. It's easy to get into a camp. It's hard to make it. So
right.
I've talked to zillions of CFL players who will jokingly say, yeah, when I came here, I told my family I'd be here for 6 months and I'm back in the NFL next year. And they came here and they had a 10-year career and they married a girl here and they had 4 kids and they live, like, you know what I mean? And my point is that once you get them here, most of them, the opportunity to go back doesn't materialize. And they actually find that they like the league and they sometimes like the country and they move their whole lives here, right? And even if they don't, they have great experiences. So I've always kind of fallen on the just get them here theory rather than worrying about how long they're going to stay here when they come. Because most guys, like, as I say, the XFL actually had a very impressive number of guys that signed in the NFL, from the 5-week season. That's more than doing in the CFL, in a traditional year. And maybe there's a bit because of the differentiation of the game. You got the Canadian players who a lot of whom are not at the same level as guys that are going to be getting opportunities in the NFL. But it's, I think you can have a league that provides an opportunity for guys to get to the NFL without it being strictly a development league. You don't have to do that.
Sure. And it can exist outside. I always believe summertime myself has been an ideal place for fans if they want something that can work. And obviously CFL has been a summertime league, but in the Americas, at least if I'm focusing that, we talk like the USFL or something like that, or even the XFL, there's plenty of time there. And I think that, to me, besides MLB, summertime to me is one of the most boring times of the year for sports.
Well, it's interesting because July is like the deadest month in football, right? Like you try to get a hold of anybody in July in the United States in football, they're off, right? Because it ramps up like July 25th or whatever. And then from then till January, February, they are like, whether you're talking college or pro or whatever. So July is kind of this weird month where there's no business happening, very little business happening. The mini camps have happened, the draft picks have been in and everything. So, but I agree with you. I think July is a wide open month. And I've always, we've always noticed that, the CFL gets on ESPN Sports Center in July, right? Because there's not as much going on. And if there's a great kick return or a big hit or something like that, it'll end up on Sports Center in the US. So I've always been a little surprised that the CFL hasn't been able to monetize that on its own. But when you talk about, it's funny because with the whole XFL thing, right? There's 3 things that jump out. Like, when are you going to play? What are the rules? And the third one, what's the trophy? But we could argue about March, we could argue about September, but July is the biggest kind of no-brainer month, as you say. Not much competition, perfect weather, hot in the south, but when isn't it? I think that's a month where you could make some real hay.
Yeah. Let's change gears to August real quick.
Sure.
This past week, we had an announcement officially from the CFL. They will be delaying the 2021 season. As of right now, tentatively August 5th is the first start date currently. I know that you actually sat down with Commissioner Randy Ambrosie talking about a lot of aspects of that. One comment that was brought up with that was backup plans among backup plans among backup plans. First off, I want to know, and at least for the American audience here, what is the current situation with, I understand there's a third wave of COVID that is affecting at least several provinces in Canada. What is the current situation now, and what could possibly be as far back as possible for a backup plan on a backup plan?
it's not good, particularly in the part of the country where most people live, which is Ontario, the most populous province where I live. I'm in Southern Ontario. I
Okay.
mean, we are locked down tight here. I mean, you can't go to the hardware store. Like it's, like
Wow.
you got to call and go curbside. I went to a dollar store about 10 days ago because I'm moving, and I bought a bunch of stuff, and they had the store. Half of it was like you could buy it, and the other half they had roped off, and they said these are not essential items, so you can't buy them. And I thought, well, come on. So I grabbed some markers and I grabbed some tape because I'm boxing everything up, and I got to the front of the thing, and they said you have to put those back. We can't process them. So that's how strict it is here right now. Like it is serious. We are unfortunately the only jurisdiction in North America where golf is banned. So now all that said, I'm not sure I agree with all these regulations, but the reason for them is we've had our highest caseloads of the entire pandemic within the last 2 weeks. And we're still, in the upper kind of 80% of what our high has been, 75% of what our high has been. And people are getting vaccinated here. I've had my first shot. I'm 53, but I don't get my second one until August 3rd. They made a decision here to, rather than, give fewer people shots 3 weeks apart, they're going to get more shots into everybody's arm and delay the second one, because you get a percentage of protection from having that first shot. And it was like, well, we're better to get more of our population with one shot than less of it with two. All that said, the government in Ontario, where 3 CFL teams play, is really not in the mood to discuss return to play protocol right now. That may change in the next little while. The question is going to be, when are they going to be in the mood to discuss fans in stands? Because that's the issue. And that's the one, I mean, even if you go back last summer, there wasn't a lot of sports going on in Canada, but there was a little bit. But I mean, stadiums were never opened up, for anything. We had bars, gyms, restaurants, strip clubs, everything was open last summer, and stadiums were not, even though, like I say, there wasn't a lot of sports going on. So the government's been extremely conservative when it comes to any gathering of large numbers of people, even when it happens to be in a large facility. Now, I think there's going to be a powerful lobby from the CFL, a strong lobby, to try and say, hey, relative to other things you were opening, we have every reason to believe that outdoors in a stadium at 25% capacity or 50% is safer than these other things that you have approved in the past. But the big thing is trying to just anticipate where the pandemic's going and the effectiveness of the vaccine, because, Canada's looking at the US, they're looking at Israel, they're looking at places like the UK and saying, okay, we've seen once you get to a certain level of vaccination, what can happen, and it can happen quickly. So the reason they came up with August 5th was they basically went to public health authorities and said, when would you be able to give us a realistic projection on the likelihood of stadiums being opened, at least partially? And the public health authorities said mid-June. So they said, okay, we're going to go August 5th, and we're going to tell everybody that we got to make a decision by mid-June. And in my conversation with Randy and Brosie, it's clear a whole lot of this is going to be out of their hands, and it's going to be in the hands of a government which has more important things to deal with than the CFL. So that's, they're going to get ICUs overflowing right now, right? They're bringing in nurses from other areas of the country. When you say, hey, how about our fans? No, it's just not, it's not a priority. So the question is, what's it going to be when we get to mid-June? I mean, that's 6 weeks away. Impossible to say, but I think that's where you could potentially see the backup plans of backup plans. Okay, we got a 14-week season on the go to start August 5th. That doesn't happen. You're probably talking about maybe a 10-week season that starts, in early September. I don't think you can credibly have, a season with fewer than 8 games. I think that's probably the number. But I'm sure somewhere on the back of a napkin they have but I think they're hoping they won't have to go there, and they are going to go to great extremes to try and do this. I mean, I think the governments in Western Canada have kind of given them the verbal knowledge that they believe that they can open up then, or the caseloads are not as bad there. Their projections, at least at this point, are earlier than maybe Ontario. So look, if they could open by August 5th, and the Ontario teams have to play the first 3 weeks on the road because there's fans in the stands out there, I think they'll do it. I think that's something they've made clear. And look, it may be a CFL season where some teams play 9 home games and 5 road games, and other teams play 5 home games. It ain't going to be perfect, right? There's not going to be, we've seen in other leagues that the symmetry and the balance that we're used to seeing in sports, may not exist in this as a one-off situation. So, we're not going to learn a lot till mid-June. But I think, we're not going to be sitting there hanging into early July, I don't think, about whether we're going to hit that August 5th. It's pretty clear and I think everybody just wants clarity. This has been, I think it was important for the league when they delayed the start of the season, to come out and say, here's what we are prepared to do. Now, if they don't get fans and stands, they could still decide to play without fans and stands if they get the return to play protocol approved. And of course, we've seen all kinds of other leagues that have done that. Problem is, you lose a ton of money doing that. And in the CFL, the franchise values really don't justify that, right? If you've got an asset in Major League Sports that's worth $1 billion and it costs you $40 or $50 million to operate that team, that's basically a small investment percentage-wise in the value of your franchise. But if you've got a franchise that's going to be worth about the same amount of money that you're going to lose playing in 1 year without fans, the analogy that I've tried to use to explain that to people is like, it's like if you have a car, right? If you've got a car that's worth $10,000 and you take it in for repairs and they say it's going to cost you $8,000, probably going to walk away from the car, right? And that's kind of where the CFL is the costs of playing without fans are going to be, in some cases, more than the actual franchise is worth. So it really is kind of an economic decision based on the business, as much as it is. For some teams, I think there's more of a heart and a passion and a we need to play aspect, but for some, it's more business, pure numbers in and out.
I feel like for that you're getting it with how the ownership structure is all set up too. Because one thing the CFL fascinates me is how you have community-owned teams, you have owned by corporation teams. Those mindsets are completely different. Same goes with totally the funding.
Different. The mission is different. Yeah, absolutely. And you've got less. As a percentage, you've got less shared revenue in the CFL than most other leagues, right? Like it is really a kind of on your own kind of business. They don't share gate revenue. They share television, but television and sponsorship after the league's expenses are paid is about $4.5 million a team. So you look at a team like Saskatchewan, there's $40 million in revenue. I mean, 10% of their revenue overall is coming from a shared revenue pool. That's tiny, right? Which is why you end up having, a much greater sort of disparity in the economics of these teams sometimes than in other leagues, because, even sports like baseball and such, right, with the digital revenues and the growth of broadcast revenues, they've been able to share more and more greater percentages of their revenues as time has gone on. And the CFL really hasn't done that. And that's, if this XFL deal doesn't happen, and even if it does, I think that's a bridge the league needs to cross, because, it's just, there's such disparity in terms of teams that can make it in this league and teams that can't. And I don't know that the owners in the toughest markets are prepared to pay the freight under the current model forever.
Right. I think one thing that interests me too with this conversation is I hear a lot of talk about the big three markets, how those ones seem to not be as capitalized on as much. Edmonton, right. Vancouver, and especially Toronto.
Well, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver.
Sorry, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, Edmonton. Sure. They have their own things they have to figure out with the mascot, but anyway, that's a conversation that keeps coming up as the big three,
right.
As much as I apologize for misinterpreting these cities.
Yeah.
I asked this actually interestingly last week to Paul Woods, who author historian for CFL here. Toronto is an interesting city in itself right now, with kind of the NFL versus CFL, which one kind of gets more of the favoritism here. But it's also the toughest market still or at least right now to market for, correct?
It is. And, I think in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, for the most part, the CFL's business model for the last few decades has been philanthropy, which can work. But, philanthropy becomes problematic when either the owner gets tired of losing money, like Montreal, where he just basically, threw the keys on the table and disappeared after the 2018 season, or when mortality happens, as David Braley passed away this last offseason and the team is being owned by his estate, or teams that just may look at it and say, there's not a lot of value here for us. And I don't know if that's where Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment is. I know that everything they do, they make money on and they create value on, and they haven't been able to with the Toronto Argonauts. So that's why people look at that and say, well, how long are they going to keep doing this? Because that's not, their mission isn't to play football in Toronto. Their mission is to create value and drive revenues. And they haven't been able to do that with the Argonauts. And Toronto is a hard city to understand from outsiders when it comes to football. I mean, it really is, right? Because it's a great sports town. They celebrate and support MLS as well as any place in the league. The Jays were the first Major League Baseball team to draw 4 million fans. The Leafs, I mean, I don't know how many decades have they been sold out for every game, the highest ticket prices in the league. And then you have the Argos. And, again, I'm old enough to remember when that wasn't the case. I was 16 when the Argos won the Grey Cup in 1983, and everybody my age went nuts. They had a riot in downtown Toronto. Not that riots are good, but the point is there was so much energy and, all that. And it really changed very quickly. I mean, it changed a long time ago. And I just did the math. I think the Argonauts have had 7 owners since 1990.
My goodness.
And the pattern is very similar, right? Somebody comes in, invests money, doesn't get a return, says, I tried, and hands the keys to the next guy. And I mean that, like the franchises don't sell for very much money when it doesn't work. Let's see if I could do the Argonaut owners. Ready? Since 1990. Here we go. Harry Ornest, Bruce McNall, Wayne Gretzky, John Candy.
Yep.
Interbrew, okay, which was the Belgian brewer that bought Labatt's. Okay,
that's right.
Sherwood Schwartz, not the guy who's the producer of Gilligan's Island, but a insurance guy from New York. Okay. Howard Sokolowski and David Cinnamon, David Braley, Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment. How am I doing?
I think you're on par. I know for sure you got everything after McNall, at least.
Yeah. And the pattern has been similar. Like they all come in, they all spend money on the front end. And then a few years later, they all go this, and the disappointing thing for Toronto is that they moved from the Rogers Centre, also known as Skydome, to an outdoor stadium of 27,000 where the MLS team plays. Is on the shores of Lake Ontario. It's a beautiful spot. And everybody thought that was going to be the turnkey. And it didn't happen. And I'm as surprised and disappointed as anybody about that. So that's, and Toronto has been a city that has really, football-wise, Canadian college football doesn't draw here. The CFL doesn't draw here. They had an international bowl, an NCAA game in December or January for 4 years. That died. The Bills in Toronto series didn't work. It's been a very finicky city. Now, football is the most popular sport in North America. Okay. Yes. So if this is just I wouldn't for a moment suggest that people in Toronto don't like football. They do. They just haven't found a product that they want to embrace. And you go into a sports bar on a Sunday here, you'll see, every color of the rainbow in NFL jerseys. And, I used to joke, I got 2 friends that don't even know each other that both dedicated their basements to the Miami Dolphins. There's a high level of NFL avidity in the city, but it's not around one team. It's not around the Bills. It's not around just one team. It tends to be just sort of scattered. And there's never been a football property since the 1980s that really became part of the heartbeat in the city. I mean, Toronto has not really been a football town, I would say, since 1983. So the whole idea is kind of how do you recapture that? And, I don't know whether an XFL CFL collaboration would do that. My thought is it couldn't do worse. That probably seeing the league on American television and getting some treatment in the American media would probably increase the appeal for some people. I don't necessarily believe that 4 downs is something you do to appeal more to people. It's probably more something you have to do just because you got to play some rules. And,
right.
If you're going to play in America and you're going to play internationally, both those, it's not just the American game is 4 downs, the international game as well.
Yes.
But I don't know. It's Toronto has been the enigma. That people have said, okay, like you got 6 million people in the GTA, right? And the Argonauts average 14,000. Tickets are not expensive. I wish I could explain it to you. I wish I could explain how many nights I have spent staring at my ceiling, insomnia, trying to figure out how do you fix, Toronto in football? How do you make this work? I have friends that call me and just want to spitball ideas they have, right? Because it drives them nuts as well.
It truly does
defies explanation.
Yeah, I mean, that's the same thing I'm thinking. I've been thinking here as of late, and like I said, talking with Paul last week, now talking with you, it just keeps spinning in my head. It's like, and especially the history. Look, I'm a Chicago Bears fan here. So like, it just related to me, like reading up on the Argonauts and understanding the history behind it, how they're pretty much the founding
1870s,
team.
1870s.
Yeah.
Like it's not, and I can tell you the number of stories, the number of times I've had this experience. I'll just give you an example here. People know what I do for a living from TV and whatever. And I meet people all the time, and I'll meet somebody who's like 70, and he'll say, I used to be an Argonaut season ticket holder for 25 years. I went to every game. I knew all the players' names, Why doesn't that happen anymore? Why isn't it like that anymore? And I'll say to them, how many kids you got? And they say, well, I got 3 kids, all grown adults, of course, yeah. Any of them CFL fans? No. That's what happened. Like that, literally, the generation, it just stopped. And in Toronto was a few things, right? You've got the Jays. The Argos won the Grey Cup in '83, for the first time in like 33 years, which was like a big, big deal, right? So you had the balloon burst, all the tension went out of that. Mm-hmm. The next year was the first year the Jays were in a pennant race, chasing Detroit in '84, right? And that was like, holy smokes. We're not just some expansion team, in the hinterland. People are talking about us, and we're in a pennant race. And in '85, they won it, right? And they went to the ALCS and played 7 games against Kansas City. And that experience kind of changed the city, right? And then the Raptors were still another, 10 years away. But Toronto was never the same after the Blue Jays got into the pennant race in the postseason. And people saw themselves as kind of a major league city. I mean, hockey, you don't need to sell hockey. But the NBA came, and, the NBA has been a bit of a weird one because it does really well in this city. And when they won it, the place went nuts. But it's in normal times, there's not an intense NBA conversation in the city. With the Raptors television wise, the Raptors as a television property don't stand up to hockey, and frankly, don't stand up to the CFL a lot of times. It's just
that I have heard.
They haven't. The Blue Jays became a national team almost from their inception. And certainly when they're successful. You can find Blue Jay fans in St. John's, Newfoundland, and Victoria, BC. The Raptors, it's been very contained to sort of the GTA. They haven't had that same national appeal. When they won, it kind of did, but the brand hasn't really been Canada the way the Blue Jays has been. But it's a very hard city to figure out. I hear people say things like, well, Toronto is full of people that weren't born in Canada, and that's why football struggles there. Okay, go to a high school field sometime and look at who's playing football. It's the children of those people. We have had a massive injection of diversity in the football playing population in this country. I mean, they are honestly, by and large, the children of immigrants in this country love football. They love to play it. They love to watch it. It's been massively successful in that regard. Now, their parents maybe don't, right? But and they aren't necessarily CFL fans. They're NFL fans. They're kids that want to play in the NFL, and they end up in the CFL. But the idea that all these people in Toronto come from countries where there isn't football and they just want soccer does not pass the reality sniff test. That is not the case. There's lots of first generation kids playing football, and in fact, they make up a significant portion of the most successful Canadians playing the game, and some of whom have gone on to the NFL. Are guys that were born outside of Canada. So I don't buy that. I hear that argument all the time about Toronto. Now, there's no question the CFL has not connected with new Canadians. I mean, you go to a Grey Cup. I've been to 18 of them or something. And when you go to the Grey Cup, I'm just saying the experience. I've seen.
No, I get it. Hey. I'm just being funny.
So it's. But when you go there and you look at the parties and they're well attended and it's a great week, but it looks like Canada in 1962. Like it's middle-aged white people, which is neither the demographic you want as a sports league, nor is it representative of Canada at all right now. And that's where the disconnect. And Randy Ambrosie's talked about that. He's talked about going into new Canadian communities and trying to, introduce the game about, things like where he's met a cab driver, in Winnipeg, and he invites him to the game the next week, things like that to try to get that. I mean, they even come up with a motto, diversity is strength. And I would say to the commissioner, I say, you got loads of diversity in your league on the field. You just don't have it in the stands. Right?
Right.
That's where your diversity challenge is. Yeah.
Right. And yeah, that lost generation that lost generation term keeps coming up more and more. It seems like it's definitely been part of these conversations here, and forget it on Twitter anymore. I mean, you can see how that goes at this point.
But that's part of what this league has to do is they have to reverse the demographic change. Like you can't, I had a friend of mine who became a CFL fan about 5 years ago. And he said to me, Dave, I don't understand how this league is going to exist in 10 years. Cause I don't know anybody like my age who watches this. And, that's where I think kind of the prospects for the CFL get a little scary is you're not looking at a league that you're saying, well, there's this bubble of young fans coming. We just need to wait for it to hit, right? It's actually the opposite. It's that our fans are aging out and we don't have enough people replacing them. And I think if anything, the pandemic is going to accelerate that.
Yeah, it definitely seems like we're in talks of the big picture anymore about what the CFL is looking at, especially with this XFL partnership. And with those talks actually is kind of based on, well, not just really the two entities joining up, but what version are we playing? As we wrap up our discussion here, I have to ask, because it's the big buzzword question, and I have to know. Leading into this, though, last week, U Sports, the Canadian Junior Football League, Canadian Football Officials Association, and Football Canada sent a joint policy letter to Randy Ambrosie for consideration. This was reported by the Canadian Press, was also on TSN and Sportsnet in Canada, essentially saying and requesting, if you will, during these talks, when they get to that venture, which, by the way, it's been mentioned, these are at financial ventures right now, not at the rule change point. But when the rule point gets to when it's needing to make a rule book, if we're talking merger, they want to try and have as many of the Canadian rules preserved as possible, which is a big question right now. Big picture wise or traditional wise, where do these two leagues go? And is there any hint of that right now? It's been 48 days since these talks have started. I know that it's been hinted this is mostly financial right now, but we keep hearing nibbles from different news sources or those that have someone in the know that certain rules might already be being discussed.
Well, I've certainly talked to people who are going on the assumption that it's going to be 4 downs.
Okay.
Like I've had and those are me. Those are not them like, here's your scoop. It's going to be 4 downs. Just me saying, what do you, if this collaborates, how do you think it's going to be? And, there are people that tell me they believe it'll be 4 downs. It was interesting in that letter that amateur football sent to the CFL, they didn't mention the downs specifically.
I did see that.
And that's because part of the country plays 4 downs. Like in high school in BC, they play 4 downs. My colleague, Farhan Lalji, who kind of does what I do on the other side of the country, we worked obviously together. He's a high school coach of some prominence out there, and he coaches 4-down football, Look, I was the play-by-play voice of a semi-pro team in Ottawa in the early 1990s that was the only Canadian team in semi-pro football, and they drew great crowds for 4-down football at the, like they were doing like half what the Rough Riders were doing at that time on a semi-pro budget team, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was 4-down football. So I do think that there are enough people in the CFL that are not hung up on 3 versus 4 downs that wouldn't kill it. Okay. I think there is a desire to see some of the league sort of in a hybrid game, whether that's a yard off the ball, whether that's a wider field, whether that's a 15-yard end zone, whether that's motion before the snap, whether that's no yards on returns. I think there are certainly elements of the Canadian game that you could integrate into, the 4-down game to make it differentiated. But there are people in this country that 3 downs is, like sacred to them. I'm not one of them. I prefer 3-down football. I prefer the Canadian game to the U.S. game. Although I think that you have to recognize that the U.S. game today is closer to the Canadian game than it was 30 years ago, right? And that's the great. You know what the greatest compliment to Canadian football is? That the U.S. game looks like our game now, and it didn't 30 years ago. Okay, they moved to us. We didn't move to them. So, I mean, that's the other thing is that 4-down football today is not, watching a running back carry it 31 times. So, even if you are somebody who loves the 3-down game and has always been opposed to 4 game, well, the 4-down game this is not your father's 4-down football, right? They've loosened the rules, they've changed things, all kinds of things to make it more explosive and higher scoring and all those kinds of things. So, but I would be surprised just because if you're doing a North American league and the US is a 4-down country, there's people in Canada that like 4 downs. There's a hardcore in Canada that will absolutely, go to the wall over 3 downs. But I feel relatively confident believing that if there is going to be a collaborative league, it will be a 4-down league.
And we'll find out, hopefully that's soon enough. Again, still kind of, at least while I'm seeing, kind of vague on the terms. Of course, there's plenty left on the table, and the season's still on the table too. So we have to figure that out if you're the CFL anyway.
Yeah, and I know people go nuts when I say that kind of stuff, like people in Canada. But again, I'm not promoting this. I'm telling you the truth of what I believe of what is happening. And that's I think that's the path that this is going to go down if it happens. And again, I don't know what the probability is that this will come together. I think it's better than 50%. I don't know that it's higher than 80%, but it's somewhere in that range. And I think that the significance of it is that it wasn't like when they decided to have formal talks, they needed to introduce themselves to each other. Like they talked for a while. I think this goes back to last summer.
Yeah, I'm getting a bit of hints on there too. And yeah, I completely understand your point, and I think this is something that keeps being brought up. And I honestly want to say some of those that are waiting for these leagues to make announcements, it gets a little antsy, then we start talking a little bit more and we get into theoretically what could happen. And it devolves down a certain path. And unfortunately that's where it kind of, I don't know, I guess don't mean to say
get nasty.
Holding a knife in each other's throat, but
it gets very nasty. And I'll tell you why I think it gets so nasty. Here's why. It's almost like the people who want to keep the CFL in Canada in 9-team league, they believe the people who are open to the XFL are signing the league's death by doing so. Okay. And so that's why they get their backs up. And people who are open to the XFL think the people who are saying CFL, ride or die, are potentially signing the league's death certificate by insisting it must stay in Canada. So both sides feel like the other is being irresponsible in their views and their acceptance of what they're putting forward. And that's why I think it gets so nasty is it's like literally people on both sides think the other league is going to kill football in Canada if their position was to be followed. And I'm not, on either of that. My position gets misstated all the time. So I'll put it on the record here.
Right.
I think that there are significant concerns about the sustainability of 3 markets in Canada. Okay. And I think with that in mind, it behooves the CFL to explore what a collaboration with the XFL would look like. That's my opinion.
Dave, thank you very much for your time. I highly appreciate you coming on the show here. For those listening, be sure to check out Dave on his own Twitter. Keeps you updated, of course, as always, with anything going on with the league, as there's going to be plenty going on through the summer. That is at TSN Dave Naylor, if you're looking up on Twitter. Anywhere else you recommend those follow you at?
TSN.ca. I write columns regularly. You can find those there as well. They're also on Twitter as well. So those are the places to find me.
All right.
And in Canada on SportsCenter. So there you go.
Hey, yeah. Nice to be on TV, right?
Exactly. Yeah. You must forget about TV after all these. Yeah, correct.
You got the online presence still. You got to get that first.
The world has changed.
CFL insider for TSN, Dave Naylor, has joined us. Dave, thank you very much. I hope the move goes smoothly here. And again, appreciate the time.
Big 36 hours coming up. Thanks. Appreciate it.
The Gridiron Gallery podcast. New episodes every Friday on your favorite podcast platforms, YouTube, and premiering first, as always, at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, only on unhingedsn.com.